Hi, what prompted this video is in the early morning before I was really awake, kind of asleep, kind of awake, kind of, whatever. That's when my brain really starts working. Sometimes that's why I can't go back to sleep. But I had this phrase when I woke up. I had this phrase in my mind. I mean, in my head, and and I don't know where it came from. It was living life in reverse. I thought, did I really dream that? Have I read that somewhere? And so I actually Googled that exact term, living a life in reverse. And the first thing I got was a poem by George Carlin. And it's not at all what I meant. He's talking about starting life at death and then going the other direction. And anyway, it's funny if you like the humor of George Carlin. But I don't think it was his idea, that poem. I think it came from somewhere else. But I started looking at that and I thought, and all of a sudden, I went, wait a minute, what I mean by that is something like, now you people who are my age and who grew up in the 70s, who were actually of an age where you could remember the 70s, you remember the Back to the Land movement of the 70s? Do you remember that? The self-sufficiency movement? And it was, the way it actually started, I think, actually originated right around the Depression era, as Franklin Delano Roosevelt was coming into in the presidency in about 1933. It was slightly post-Depression, or on the way out of the Depression. Back then, you couldn't find work, you couldn't find food, you had to stand in line for bread and all that kind of stuff. You know how the Great Depression was. I didn't live it, but if you've read anything about it, you know. People were jumping off buildings when the banks failed and all that kind of thing. And you can look up that if you want to. But the Back to the Land movement of the 70s was considered a hippie movement. But it started basically around Depression times. That was the first time, I think, that we'd removed ourselves from an agrarian lifestyle, and we were, doing okay. And World War II and the stock market, I mean, the whole thing. And in 1933, the bank had collapsed. The banking system had completely collapsed. About 25% of the labor force was unemployed. 25%. And prices and productivity had fallen to like a third of their levels that they were in 1929. But anyway, along with that was lower income, rents, dividends, and profits, whatever. Anyway, the factories were shut down, and farms and homes were lost to foreclosures. Oh, doesn't this sound familiar? The resulting lower incomes meant that people had no ability to spend or save their way out of the crisis. And it just perpetuated the slowdown. And it was like a never-ending cycle. So, farmers weren't technically counted as part of the workforce, but they sure did lose their farms and their land to foreclosure in record numbers. So, in a speech to the Democratic Party accepting the nomination in '32, FDR, he pledged this New Deal for the American people if elected. Okay, Bidenomics. Anyway, he put it into action. It was a bunch of programs, government programs, economic recovery. The first 100 days, not 500 days. The first 100 days of his administration, he pushed all kinds of legislation through. Banking holidays, and to end the runs on the banks, and started new federal programs. A lot of the alphabet agencies were born at that time. Excuse me just a second. Okay, sorry. We got a bunch of new alphabet agencies at that time. He started some kind of youth corps, and he established the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which has a lot to do with electricity in my area. And he established the FERA, which I believe is a precursor to FEMA. It was called the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. and I mean all kinds of programs to get jobs for people. I mean, if you look at the list of alphabet agencies that FDR instituted, I mean, they're like a book long. There's a huge list of these things. I don't think a lot of them are actually in effect today, although they may have just been renamed to be something new, right? So we got the New Deal, not the Green New Deal, the New Deal from FDR to try to bring the country back from the brink of destruction. You know, we got Bidenomics, which has bankrupted a lot of the country. Promises never kept, promises of things that were totally ineffectual for the purpose they were stated. But anyway, let's talk about, during the time of the New Deal, there was a great big homesteading movement. Now, we weren't that far away from being an agrarian type society, a lot of farmers and such, but people had gotten on track and they'd gone back to the cities and gotten their jobs back and all that, and everybody was doing stuff. But during that time, there was a movement to become more self-sufficient and don't rely on the government, since the government kind of was missing in action. But I think a lot of the back to 70s movement started back then with what was happening during the New Deal time period. But you know, there were no jobs. There was no food. You had to wait in line for food if you could even afford to buy it. And you know, no jobs. You still got to eat. There's only one way to get your food, and that's to grow it. In the Depression, they always said, you know, have a flock of chickens, preserve your food, grow gardens, victory gardens. Remember the victory gardens? And now it's the opposite. You're hoarders. We can't have you independent from us, then we can't tell you what to do. That's our government now. But, you know, no jobs, broken supply chains. If you don't grow it, you won't eat it. That kind of thing is happening now. We saw a lot of this kind of thing start up a year or two after the pandemic was released on the world. And they actually did the opposite out of fear and closed down everything when that was not the way to go. Battery, sorry, hang on. Okay, where was I? So a year or two after the origins of the pandemic and all the panic over that and lockdowns and all that kind of stuff, we saw a lot of people latching hold of this idea that they should be homesteading. They should be growing their own food because we can find any, right? And I don't know the percentage that followed through with that idea. As in the 70s, so now, many didn't succeed at that. Some had never experienced the bone-crushing exhaustion of the physical work that's required to grow gardens and keep livestock and maintain property. They were just overwhelmed by all that. And they were also overwhelmed by the fact that when you homestead and you're trying to disconnect from the system, you completely sink or swim based solely on your own efforts. Nobody's coming to save you, not some government handout. You're on your own. And a lot of people couldn't handle that. Some overcame that feeling and they pushed through it and they made a success out of the homestead. Others didn't. In the 70s, there were a lot of these trust fund babies and parents who were very well off, and they just revolted against everything their parents believed, and they went off to form communes, and some went off on their own. I actually have a book called Carrying Water, which is a little autobiographical book about a couple who did that on their own, left their jobs, and you know, they had to haul water from a creek and everything. So after this big pro-consumerism thing that happened after World War II and prosperity started happening, people were acquiring all kinds of stuff. And a lot of people became burned out with that. They saw no satisfaction in endless acquisitions of stuff. And that stuff required more money to buy, more money to maintain, crowded their lives, and they became very disenchanted. And they wanted meaning to their lives. So some get with like-minded folk. In the 70s, they got with like-minded folks. They started the communes. They divested themselves of a lot of the trappings of what they considered civilization and their parents' life. they were shedding it like threadbare clothing as they went down the driveway, just throwing off pieces of that. And things that don't matter to them, that didn't matter, that when they found out, they were just dead ends. They made their own baby food. Gosh, I remember, oh gosh, there was the actress in the 70s that she was always, it was a big thing. I read an article about her making her own baby food, which actually is not a bad idea now, considering all the garbage that they put in your food and they don't tell you it's in there because they don't want you to know it's in there, because nobody would eat it unless they have a death wish. But they, many of those people in the 70s, they didn't have wells. And there was some similarity between that kind of life and the old order Amish, without the really religious component. Although people are going, oh, spirituality, which to me is not. It's just, I can also be a dead end, just spirituality without anything to put faith in. Someone to put faith in. Anyway, we're not going down that road, but they were shaped by forces they couldn't define, because back then, the internet didn't exist in the 70s. We didn't have the internet. I remember the first computers coming out, the Commodore 64. All my husband and my sons were freaking out over that Commodore 64, because my younger son especially was really into the techie stuff. And older son is more artistic, but, they're both intelligent men. But what happened is a lot of people who left the hard life that they had created for themselves, they eventually went back to the suburbs or went back to actual employment and that kind of thing. They may have gone back to suburban life, but they held on to their skills. They held on to what they learned, their experiences, and their changed confidence in what they could accomplish for themselves. A less dependent attitude. So they may have put in raised beds instead of row crops because they didn't have the room to do that anymore. And of course they used indoor plumbing again. And they lived in close proximity to other people who've never had their attitude that they have toward consumerism. And they back off from the purchases and the acquisition of everything. So they may have gone back and stepped back away from the very hard life of carrying water and washing your clothes on a washboard or whatever they were doing. They were doing a lot of that in the 70s, believe it or not. But they were forever changed for the better, is what I'm trying to say. And they took a lot of their experience back to their suburban life with them. So we need to change for the better, to decomplicate. So that's kind of what I mean by living life in reverse. Disconnecting from the unnecessary, the trappings of our current lives, shedding the debt and expenses that you really don't need, like the endless subscriptions that people have for this, that, and the other. And I think it's a good thing to go back to being bare bones as far as social media. It's hard to disconnect entirely from all current internet information, because sometimes that is the only way that we know what's happening and can prepare ourselves for specific events. But pick one social media platform to stay with. One, junk the rest. Most of them are just trackers anyway. Junk the rest of them. I know people are not going to believe what I'm telling you, but I literally have one social media. I have this platform because I get to talk to you and I get to hear from you. And I get to hear news that the mainstream media refuses to report, or figure out what's propaganda and what's actual news. Sometimes that ain't easy these days. But don't buy the trap that you got to belong to 10 social media platforms to be a real person in our society anymore, Get your hands in the dirt. I mean, my fingernails are non-existent now because it's garden season, or garden season's winding down, whatever. It was a tough battle, let me tell you. But get some nature therapy and find a way to grow food. Find your way of growing food wherever you are. Maybe you can't homestead. Maybe you don't think you can buy land. Prices are insane right now. They are. They're going to have to come down. They may not crash. They're going to have to come down. But find your way of growing food. If you can't do row crops, do nice raised beds. Supplement the dirt. Find local sources for food that you can't do for yourself, like beef or bacon or whatever, things you can't do for yourself. And back off from all the things that keep your gut in a knot. There's so much. I mean, I know when I have to detox myself. You saw I pulled out my quilt that I started to work on. Small quilt project, not the big one, but just not an overwhelmingly big one, but just a small one, table runner, But it still does the same thing. Do what you have to outside your perimeter. If you have to work out there, fine. But when you come back to it, you guard that jealously. Our ancestors knew what security and prosperity and wealth and survival was, and that was land. It doesn't have to be a lot of land. I know some people got hundreds of acres. I know people got 30 acres. You don't need 30 acres to survive on. To grow every bit of food you need on, you don't need that much land. And it's almost impossible. The government does not want you to own land. Remember you'll own nothing and be happy? No, I'll own what I want, and I'll be as happy as I plan to be. And that's the truth of it. So, be thrifty, don't be rabid consumers. And I think it's a good thing to do to divest yourself of stuff. Not just give away everything you own, but prioritize. If you've got stuff in boxes in your basement and you haven't seen it and you don't even know what it is, might be time to get rid of it. It makes room in your life and it makes room in your head and mind for other things. And it takes up space. It takes up real space, but it also takes up emotional space. You feel crowded. You feel pushed. So minimalize your life for maximum satisfaction. What the heck is that? Well, I heard something weird out there. It's like something crashing through the brush. So it doesn't mean you have to live austerely, but you do need to prioritize what really gives you daily satisfaction and toss the rest of it. And like the rest of the 70s people, the 70s back to the land movement, throw your life into reverse. It doesn't mean you're going backwards in a negative connotation kind of way. You're reprioritizing. When you get lost on a trip, in spite of GPS, you go back to the point where you weren't lost, and you change direction from there, and you get where you're going eventually. So, reassess. Sometimes that is harder than it sounds. Reassess and shift gears and find a better path for yourself. The Back to the Land people in the 70s had something, and it was not always anti-capitalism. It was more anti-consumerism than it was anti-capitalism. They wanted to find a better way to live between capitalism and socialism. There's always a better way than socialism. What they don't understand is that socialism, the ones that are pushing for socialists, Bernie Sanders, they don't understand that socialism always leads to communism, because socialism makes conditions right for a dictator to rise up. And when you get the dictator, you get communism. Happens every time. And I don't want to hear well, it's never been done right yet. Okay, you think in all of the years of human history, it hasn't been done right? And you've got the magic formula for it? Please. It doesn't work because it's not a workable system. That's why it doesn't work. That's why it's never been done right. Because it's not a workable system, and human nature gets in the way every time. So, that's my talk for today. I'm going. I hope any of this made sense. But when I heard that live your life in reverse, I thought, what does that mean? And I realized that's what we did here. When we bought this house, price-wise, it was 2 steps down from the last 2 houses we bought. It was lower than the one before the last one we had. Had more land. It had potential, which I get frustrated because I can't seem to realize, because now I'm older. My husband can't do the things he did. So the potential for this place, the vision I saw for it, will probably never be realized by me. But I'm not the last. I'm not the end of the line. There are other people after me who may be able to survive here. So, and they can start living their lives in reverse. Agrarian lifestyle. Go back there. You may have to do that. Now we're going to have the government, just a different kind of government, different kind of person. And they may attempt to interfere with your freedoms, as they have been doing for years now. So I don't have a solution to all of it, or how it's going to look for you to do what I'm saying, but only you know your life, and only you can be brutally honest with yourself, and I think that's what needs to happen. So I'm going to go. Have a great day, and we'll catch y'all later. Bye.